Okay. So far we don't have any public attendees, but we'll officially start the Planning Commission workshop on the context-based classification. I don't know, Commissioner Joseph, if you had wanted to say anything to start it. Not hearing. Oh, go ahead.
Do I have to?
No, I don't think so.
Well, if I don't have to do anything, I wasn't on the agenda, so I just figured I'd just watch and give comments at the end and questions and stuff like that.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure you didn't want to say something.
Thank you.
Sure. We'll get things started, and Katrina, if you would mind introducing everyone.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Katrina Corcoran, Planning Commission staff. I am the co-lead on the update of the mobility section of the unincorporated Hillsborough County Comprehensive Plan. We gave a briefing on that mobility section on September 14th in front of the Planning Commission. And based on that discussion, we decided to have this context-based classification virtual workshop to give some more information on context classification to the planning commissioners and allow them to discuss it and bring forward any questions with county staff. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Matt Lewis. He's an executive planner with Community and Infrastructure Planning through Hillsborough County. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrina. Hello, my name is Matt Lewis. Katrina's just introduced me. Can everyone see my presentation okay? Right now, that's my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. So as Christina said, Katrina, I'm sorry. As Katrina said, Hillsborough County is evolving the transportation element of its comprehensive plan into the mobility section. And if you remember from the workshop a week or so ago, it's bringing a renewed focus on safety, equity, multimodal choices, and context-sensitive road design. So we're here today to talk about the context-based classification system that's built into this new mobility section. And I'm going to talk about how we built that context-sensitive road design and then get into what we're going to do with it as the next steps later on. So this evolution of the county and incorporation of this context classification system, what it's really doing is it's translating the future land use and livable communities chapters into the mobility section. So that the roads can further the county's vision for its built environment. It's a bridge between future land use and transportation. It takes the road and really establish it as a key to a place. Because when you think about a street and all the streets you've experienced, it's basically a defining part of places that you go, whether it's a main street downtown, whether it's your street in your neighborhood, if that's a suburban neighborhood or if it's a townhouse in Ybor, the street really helps define what type of place you're in. And so these types of places, urban, suburban, and rural places, they have different types of users. And when you think about different types of users, that means they have to be designed differently depending on where they're at. If you have an urban main street, it's extremely important that you have sidewalks adequate to support that park once philosophy that on Main Street follows. If you have a suburban neighborhood street, you need the bike facilities and pedestrian facilities to support vulnerable users, but you have to also recognize that vehicular access is going to be very important because they're more than likely commuting to work versus walking to work. So in this way, streets are integral to land use. They're basically a use of land. And what the context classification system is doing is informing that street design in accordance with the land use or community plan that a street is located in. It's also going to inform the land development code. It's going to inform access management on that same rural to suburban spectrum. The way you build your grid, the way you access property is going to vary from whether or not you're a rural area or an urban area. Urban areas, you know that higher levels of connectivity are desired. Speeds are dropping very significantly as you have more and more pedestrians in an area. And so that means that you have a more permeable network. Another thing to think about is that we're looking at level of service differently. We're having a more multimodal level of service now. We have various modes are being addressed in the comprehensive plan. So the context-sensitive, context-based classification system really starts to create the system that makes all those modes of transportation viable and allows safety to be dealt with in the context of the land use a road is being passed through. So what this really is a predictable framework to improve streets consistent with the future land use and community plans. They become part of the implementation of that land use. So what's included in the context classification system? It's not all roads. Basically what we looked at were Hillsborough County's owned and maintained roads. If a road is passing through a jurisdiction, it's not context class because we don't have control over the land uses in a given jurisdiction. We can't establish the road design based on a land use that we don't control. What we've really looked at is arterials, collectors, and principal arterials. It's the major road network. The smaller neighborhood roads are built by developers through the subdivision process, and that also gets informed through the update of the comprehensive plan. But what we're looking at here is a way to give the county direction on how to build or improve its own network. So roads that the county plans to build through the corridor preservation plan, those are also included. Those will be context classed, and when the designer gets in place to start building that road, they'll have that context-based classification to know what type of approach to use on that construction. So when we applied the context classification to Hillsborough County, what we did is we started with the FDOT system and we calibrated it to our future land use and livable communities elements. So a few key changes that happened because of that is C2T in the FDOT system, which is the rural town, becomes C3T, the suburban town in Hillsborough County, because we don't necessarily have rural towns here. What we have are suburban areas that are designated as town centers or gathering places or key areas in various community plans and in different ways. And then C5 and C6 are not as applicable in Hillsborough County. C6 is an urban core, city of Tampa, downtown is the classic example of that. And C5 is a more intense area. FDOT would look for you having a form-based code adopted for the application of a C5. Because we're looking at a comprehensive plan, we would have to have a strong form-based approach in the land use category to say this is a C5. That's going to demand a high degree of interconnectivity, a high degree of building massing adjacent to the street. You know, now you're talking about going to 5 or 6 stories. Think about a classic fixed guideway TOD. That's a C5 type of development. And I should mention, if I don't know why the FDOT system uses this context C-based system, but this is basically the same as the T1 through 6 urban to rural transect that you might be familiar with in land uses. It's taking everything from the natural space, going all the way to the most intense area of human development and categorizing everything in between. So this is what our context classification systems really look like after applying it to our future land use areas. We have the rural areas and the natural areas. And then we have a large suburban area that includes suburban residential area. These are classic neighborhoods, and suburban commercial. These are your neighborhood centers and regional centers. Suburban town is one that we created to address where the community plans are saying they want activity to focus in a pedestrian friendly way. And then urban general is going to pop up in your more urban areas throughout the county, like planned urban areas like Brandon, the university area, town and country. So how did we get there? The first thing we do is we look at the comprehensive plan and see how it generally defines rural, suburban, and urban areas. And then we basically, step 2, aggregate them into draft areas. From that aggregation, we start the initial context assignment. C1 and C2, this is areas outside the urban service area where we don't expect to put services to support suburban or urban level development. So that naturally puts it into a rural category. C4, these are more urban land uses, but the thing with our urban land uses is if you look at a CMU 12 type of land use, it has a C4 level population and it has a C4 level FAR, but the use mix within that allows also suburban level, which is a C3 level of population and the C3 level of use mix and FAR. So we augmented those C4 areas by putting the expected growth. This is where in the long term, the 2045 plan from the long range transportation plan, you'll see more population and employment density allocated. So we've got a long range transportation plan that plans to serve a more dense population and employment area in Brandon. This gives the roads that more dense population and employment density design to go along with the capacity that comes from the other plan. And then one of the things we did with C3T is you have within your community plans areas that are identified as focus areas for pedestrian activity. And those are easy enough to find. We augmented it with the LDC where they had overlay districts that identified pedestrian friendly areas. And finally, we added DRIs into it to get those mixed use areas and DRIs that are identified as future pedestrian centric areas. And just so that we could be sure that we captured everything where you might see pedestrian activity, we looked at areas of heavy pedestrian activity by using the basically Vision Zero areas where you would have more pedestrian and bicycle crashes. We use it as a surrogate to identify pedestrian demand. And then the C3R and C3C, those are just the residential and commercial areas. That's most of the area inside the urban service area. Then finally, when we had this list, we went through a manual check to look at areas of special concern. If we had identified a long stretch of C3T because of heavy pedestrian activity, we went in and just drove the road, dropped into Google Maps, and just looked at what the uses along that area, what the plan for the area was, to verify that everything there should be C3T. Should C3T be extended to other areas, or should something be changed to something else? A good example of that you'll see later will be Waters Avenue. Waters Avenue is a Vision Zero high pedestrian activity and crash corridor that passes through a whole bunch of different types of areas. So there's a particular portion of it where you don't have the same level of pedestrian crashes. That's more of a C3C going through an industrial park, whereas the rest of it is absolutely got uses and adjacencies that lead to expectations of pedestrian mixes. The other thing we did with areas of special concern is we looked at the town centers identified in community plans and just looked at the network leading into them. So if you had a main street identified somewhere and there was a collector network leading into that main street, it would be appropriate to make sure that that is also capable of holding holding the pedestrian volumes that the main street is expected to hold. So just going into each one, this is currently how the comp plan organizes land use into the rural to urban transect. This is in the future land use chapter. There's a table that says what land uses are more rural and what land uses are more urban. We translated that into a context classification system. And the areas in the plan that has non-residential development areas, that is looking, in order to identify those, you really look at the surrounding context. This is what all the community plans in the county say are their various centers. Now, when a community plan identifies a center, sometimes it will also discuss what they want that center to feel like, what kind of form of development it will have when it reaches its vision point. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they only identify that there's an existing center with uses. So when that form is identified and pedestrian activity is mentioned or mix of multimodal options is mentioned in those areas, that's when we started to give these centers C3T. So Apollo Beach has a mention of form and multimodal options. Palm River has mentions of form. Town and Country, Brandon. And areas like that get classified as C3T because they're asking for a particular type of development pattern adjacent to these roads. Areas that aren't are not given that classification necessarily. But a good portion of these areas that you see on this map get designated C3T. So just in summary of what this is, when we assign the context classification, first thing we do is look at the urban service area. If we plan to serve an area with urban level amenities or suburban level amenities, then it should have an urban and suburban level road design going along with it. Areas outside the urban service area that aren't planned to be served with those type of amenities should have a rural level of road design. So we've got one half of the county outside the urban service area designated as rural, the other half designated as suburban. And the next thing we do is we do that C3T assignment. And that is looking at the community plans, DRIs, like I just went through, and taking roads in those C1, C2, and C3C areas that should be C3T, color those C3T. And then finally, looking at the C4, you look at your urban land use categories, overlay your expected population and employment growth and density, and change the roads in those areas to C4. If they were previously C3T, they are now C4. C4 would anticipate the same level of pedestrian activity that was anticipated in the plan for the community, so it's okay to change that. If they were like previously C3R, C3C, they're obviously moving to C4 because it's expected to be urban level development. So this is what it ends up looking like. A few key things to look at in this map is right here, County Road 579. This is an area where there is actually a bit of pedestrian crashes. And we looked at it and said, why would that be more pedestrian activity than other roads in the area? It's going through basically Sefner. It should be more suburban in character, but this is a road anchored on either side by schools. So there's a good chance that the pedestrian crashes may be clustered at the school ends of it. We didn't have enough data to say whether or not that was the case. So like I say, designate the road C through T. Another one is Fletcher, where you see a lot of pedestrian crash activity that gets designated C through T. And we looked at that and we looked at the land uses along it and saw that they were actually very neighborhood in scale when you reach the intersections like Fletcher and Rome, Fletcher and North Boulevard. It's not regional stuff going on there. So there are areas that really could be walkable if you chose to make that walk. So what are we going to do with this next? So the comprehensive plan is going to include a context-based classification system. Then what we will have to do with that is use that context-based classification map to build a complete streets guidebook. The complete streets guidebook will be used to take it the step further that it needs, so that the designer of the road knows whether or not they're designing a street for a commercial area or a neighborhood. Depending on which area you're in, you're going to have a different mix of users and a different mix of elements that are going to be important. Approaches to speed are going to vary, whether or not you're in a regional commercial area, which is going to be more auto-oriented. It's going to have a lot more. Sorry about that. And if you're in a neighborhood commercial area, which should be an area where the commercial uses around you could be things that you could easily access by bike or walking and not need to push your shopping home with a shopping cart. And then finally, once we have that complete streets guidebook that tells the designer what typology they're in, we will be building the design manual, which we don't have right now. And that will tell the designer what elements are important and how to use those elements in that context. That's where it tells you the pavement depth, what type of materials to use for your bike racks, that type of thing gets included in your design. And finally, our schedule. We have talked the concepts of context-based classification and subsequent complete street concepts with various TPO committees. We talked to the Citizen Advisory Committee on September 1st. We talked to the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee on September 8th, the Technical Advisory Committee on September 13th, and the Livable Roadways Committee on September 15th. They gave us great input. We're taking that input and using it really in the next steps of these, the Complete Streets Guidebook and the design manual, to make those as strong a document as we possibly can. The context-based classification, which is going to be housed in the comprehensive plan, is going to workshop today, which is where we are now. And then we'll be moving into the public hearing process with the rest of the mobility section of the plan. And with that, I will open it to any questions you might have.
Thanks, Matt. Are there questions or discussion from the planning commissioners?
Matt, I had a question. This is Karen Kress.
Hi, Karen.
Good presentation. And this might be outside of the scope, but it seems related. When development is proposed, one of the things that we tend to ask about is the number of access points. So for instance, if we're, if they're building a development that only has one way in and out, then, it's pretty safe to assume that a lot of the residents are going to end up driving for most of their trips. Can this at all be addressed through what you're doing here?
It certainly helps. When you think about context classification, if you are in C4, or say we had a land use category that necessitated a C5 context, any development proposed in those types of contexts or on those roads that are classified in that way should probably think about having a more permeable network. Because one of the things a pedestrian looks for in an environment to walk is not a straight path, it's options. It's the ability to take the safest, most comfortable route they can. So multiple connections, multiple intersections are more important as you get into those more urban contexts, and less important in the suburban context where you wouldn't expect to have as many pedestrians or bicycle users as you would in the other context. So the permeability of the network doesn't have to be as high in those types of areas. So it can definitely inform the way you build a network in a neighborhood.
I see that Commissioner Powell has some questions. He's on the phone, so if he's able to unmute. Commissioner Powell?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Sorry, it doesn't allow me to unmute myself here. A really great presentation. I am actually super excited that we have this, coming. A question that, or two questions I think I sort of have in my head are, with these new classifications, how are they going to relate to, are we going to subscribe, like at a certain level of service on, a road that is C3R, that, are we going to also, is there going to be a correlation between that and, okay, this road has, X, level of service, during peak hours, AM and PM?
That's a very good question. From the point of view of the automobile transportation system, I know that the level of service standards are actually coming with the capital improvements chapter, as well as the quality of service that would come with the bicycle and pedestrian networks. I think the context-based classification system can certainly inform how you implement those standards, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that develops those standards. The volumes of automobiles carried in a given area may be the same, whether you're in an urban or suburban or rural area, but the way you accommodate that volume could change based on context. That interface between the automobile mode, the pedestrian mode, and the bicycle mode is obviously going to change based on context, and the speed you apply in those areas is going to change based on it. But the level of service doesn't necessarily have to. So long way of saying this could inform level of service, but it's not going to define it.
Okay. Will this also then allow us to project the level of service, and maybe have like a future map for, going from the yellow, like C3R line to C3C, like that we project that, this area, will eventually go from here to, a more higher traffic area, or road that, as more and more development comes along X road, that is going to go from one color essentially and go to another one, because of all of the new traffic that is going to, undoubtedly, happen in that little section. I mean, if not, I think it's like that would be a really great idea for future planning.
Yeah. I hate to do this to you, but projecting level of service is a bit outside my area of comfort as far as expertise, because I'm not the type of person that can pop into the transportation models
and see whether or not one element of it or another element of it should be changed based on a context-based classification system. I don't know that this could, I mean, obviously the system by itself can't project a level of service, but I couldn't tell you whether or not it can be used in conjunction with the modeling they use to allocate population growth to project anything.
Okay, well,
I do think that as we make changes to the future land use map, or if there was a community plan or special area study done on a certain area, it might result in us changing context classification of a segment of roadway. And the fact that the land use and the transportation are linked in that way does to some degree, it's not immediately linked to, I think, the way the projections are done, but I think the land use certainly is a factor in how we project the future traffic.
well, I think that just having a conversation now, I think it's something to consider as we go forward with planning and new projects, coming up that, we're X road, let's just take, Bloomingdale, for example, it's intended, certain sections to have 1,800 vehicles during the AM and PM, peak hours. And now that we're going to add, let's say there's, there is actually apartment communities that are coming along that section of Bloomingdale past Providence going towards 301. And as you continue to add more and more density to those areas, obviously you can have, higher levels of traffic. And I think that it would be a really wise area or wise idea to show that, hey, this is where something is at now, and this is where it's going to be going, or this is where it can go, for planning growth. So that's all I wanted to say.
Right. I think based on the fact that this is the map that they've got right now, it's based on our future land categories. I think that's something we're going to have to continually maintain to make sure that as we make changes and say we, start to identify that a segment of Bloomingdale needs to have a different treatment than the rest of it, then we need to have that conversation with them about changing the content.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Melissa's saying is when you have this context-based classification that bridges your land use and transportation chapters of your comprehensive plan, if you were to do some level of planning on Bloomingdale, and Bloomingdale is currently classified in the proposed system here as C3C. And when you look at the commercial centers located along Bloomingdale Avenue, what you have are various nodes of either regional commercial or more neighborhood commercial development. So if you were to look at reclassifying a portion of that C3C to a C3P in a community planning process, now questions like that 1,800 cars a day traveling through, or peak hour cars probably, traveling through that C3T, are those traveling to it, through it? How do we address the volume of this mode of traffic with and mitigate its impacts on the expected more vulnerable users like pedestrian and bicyclists? You can't have that conversation now without thinking about those users. That's the latent benefit of this.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, Commissioner Powell?
No, Melissa, that was it.
Okay. All right, I see Commissioner Joseph.
Make sure my mic's on. I just want to say it was a really great presentation. This thing has come a far way from the first time we saw it. As a matter of fact, in prepping for this workshop, I went back and reviewed what came before us last time. And in big ways it hasn't changed, but in a lot of little ways it has changed a lot. And the ways it has changed are a lot of things that I think were important, a lot of things that are specific and germane to Hillsborough County. I thought it was really cool and interesting. Mr. Lewis mentioned questioning FDOT's use of the C2T class. I think that was very wise on our part and I think that's one of the things that speaks to this document that's coming forward now, being more focused on what's going on in Hillsborough County. I noticed some small things throughout the document, like in some of the images, like the transect image, you guys went back in and swapped around locations of like the suburban town. And then you also went in and changed some of the lot patterns going on to more visions of what we want to see coming in the future. Some little subliminal things going on in there that I thought were good, but tied specifically to Hillsborough County. One interesting thing that I noted, and it's really the hierarchy, the way it's set up. When I was looking at, I'm not sure which slide it's on, but one of the slides kind of lists out context, and I noticed that the suburban town is placed right after the rural, but it's more of a dense kind of, I guess, class, if you will. When I look at the kind of the slide like number 6, and you look at kind of the image of the density on the suburban town, it's kind of closer to the urban general. But I noticed when you list out, like write out the classes, suburban town kind of falls after rural. And I didn't know if that was an important shift right there, if that's just been, I realized that in the numbering, it makes sense because you have C1, C2, and then what is it, C3 maybe, or it shifts right there at the town one. So maybe it just fell that way because of the numbering. But it seems like if you're looking at it as a hierarchy, that one should be shifted down somewhere and away from that. That was one thing that I noted that was kind of odd, struck my eye. But otherwise, I think, and even the way Mr. Lewis was talking about it in the presentation has come such a long way from the way that it was spoken about the first time, where there was kind of this reliance on, you know, the consultant and what FDOT had brought forward. Again, I point back to Mr. Lewis' opening discussion, questioning what FDOT did. I thought that was, you know, when I heard that come out of his mouth, I was like, okay, great. We're really looking at what's going on now. So I see Mr. Patrick on the line also. I want to tip my hat to you because I know I gave all of you a little bit of agita at the start of this, what was going on. So, but I think where it's come to now is really great. And I think I want to say to my commissioners, questions we've got so far from Commissioner Kress and Commissioner Powell are really great. They get into details that Mr. Lewis and Ms. Ornita, you handled well, that really, you know, talk about other things that kind of spawn from what we're doing here. And I wanted to say, I think you're going to get a lot of that going forward. And I hope you guys don't take it to heart. I think it speaks to the work that was done here, that the commissioners can look at it and kind of start to pick up on these questions that, as you said, will be handled in other words, design manuals and development code. There's a lot of other regulatory and legal things that will be hammered out because of this. I think having this here allows those conversations to come to the forefront. So I wanted to commend everyone involved in this on the great work and the change that I've seen from what was brought forward the first time to what we have now. So good job, everyone. That's all.
Thank you, Commissioner.
That's all I have.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
This is Dan. I don't know if you can hear me or see me. This is one that I'm less familiar with using. Thank you for the terrific presentation. This is definitely an amazing step in such a positive direction for our community. This is probably maybe a little bit beyond sort of the scope of this project, but it just gets me to think if there's any thinking about how this might connect in any way to mobility fees, and I wonder if that came up.
This is Commissioner Linkus, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I'm sorry, yes, it is.
Yeah, sorry, I can only see either the presentation or the activity in the webinar. I can't see both at the same time. So
and I figured out how to turn my webcam
on. We did not look at this when we built the context-based classification system as something that can inform a mobility fee. That's not to say it can't, but our mobility fees are built with assessment and benefit zones that are large compared to what you would expect a C4 context to look like. So we didn't think going into this thing about how it could inform that type of mobility fee. Maybe it can, maybe it can't, but it's not part of what we thought about.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. The scale here would be very different from how those are structured. But I also wonder if there's an opportunity to prioritize some kinds of certain investments based on the types of uses that the different contexts might suggest, the types of improvements that the context might suggest. So I think it's probably not outside the scope of what you all are looking for. I totally agree with your point on there, but it just seems like an interesting opportunity to perhaps leverage in the future.
It will absolutely inform through the Complete Streets Guidebook and the design mail that get built later. It will absolutely inform the elements of a street that are going to be more important in a C4 versus a C1, C2 area. As you move into more urban areas, your user mix is going to say that the sidewalk is extremely important for mobility. It's a primary means of getting around in these areas. So the width of that's going to change in an urban area versus a suburban or rural area. Whereas the lane might shrink. The lane might have been 11 or 12 feet in an area that was expected to have more truck traffic, might go down a little bit in a C4 area to something that would slow the traffic to account for the more vulnerable users in the area.
Great. I had one other question too, and it may be also beyond the scope, but I just wondered if I'm not even sure if it's in the realm of what the Planning Commission looks at, but is lighting part of this and part of the context sensitive design features? Would that even get into the realm of lighting?
At a comp plan level, we didn't have much to say lighting there, but it's absolutely important in various contexts. I mean, if you're in C1, C2, like you're in a natural area or a rural area, you don't want to orange up the sky in that particular area. But as you're entering the more C4 areas, pedestrian scale lighting is going to be very important because, again, the context is telling the designer of the road and the people that are building the land development code that implements the comprehensive plan that in this C4 area, you should expect to see more pedestrian and bicycle users. So using the giant Cobra lights lighting the lanes may be less important than using sidewalk lighting, helping people see at night.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting there. Thank you. I do now better understand how some of these pieces come together. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other questions? Almost everybody who's on the line. Mr. Joseph.
I just wanted to say again to you too, I think it's also good, just besides the presentation and the document itself, the way the two agencies, the Planning Commission and the, neighborhood design,
community and infrastructure planning
department have worked together on this one. I know at the start of this, there was questions about who would take the lead on what and how things would come together. And I think it's really smart the way things have sort of filtered out and worked themselves out through this process. So even the idea of, this portion of it going into the mobility section, I think that's a smart thing too. I didn't miss that, obviously, but I was in agreement with that. So I thought, especially the way it's being spoken about, I do think it fits properly in the mobility with what I know of the mobility element so far it's coming forward. So I do think that's good. And I hope that works out and doesn't cause any consternation going forward. I hope I don't regret saying that, but good job on that. So wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other chats or folks turning their cameras on. Okay, well, I think with that, we can conclude the workshop at 11:50. Thank everyone for their time and participation.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks. Have a good week.
all right, you too.
Thank you. Bye.
you.
Bye.